In 2003, a small team of researchers flew into one of the most remote stretches of rainforest on the planet. They were not looking for gold, not for new species, not for undiscovered plants with medical applications, not for any of the things that usually bring outsiders into places that outsiders have no business being. They were looking for something that their colleagues back home had told them they would not find, something they had been warned, with a particular patience that senior academics reserve for younger ones with inconvenient hypotheses was a projection, a romanticization, the kind of thing that sounds profound in a grant proposal and dissolves on contact with reality. They were looking for a people who did not experience anxiety the way the rest of the world did. Not a people without problems, not a people without grief or loss, or the ordinary difficulties of being alive in a body on a planet that does not particularly care whether you survive. Those things exist everywhere. The researchers knew that. What they were looking for, what the early field reports had suggested, what the linguistic analysis had tentatively pointed toward, was a people for whom the specific psychological experience of chronic anticipatory dread had simply not developed. A people who faced danger when danger arrived and set it down when it left, who did not carry the future as a weight in the present, who had in their language no word for worry because the concept itself had never required one. They found the Chewong of the Malay Peninsula, and what they found inside that community did not simplify their understanding of the human mind. It complicated it in ways that some of them are still working through 20 years later. The Chewong are a small indigenous community, semi-nomadic, forest dwellers, a people whose relationship with the natural world operates on assumptions so different from those of the industrialized societies that the researchers spent the first 2 weeks simply trying to map the gap between their own thinking and the thinking they were observing. The absence of a word for worry was real. The linguist confirmed it early. Not a gap in vocabulary, not a concept that existed but lacked a dedicated term, a genuine absence. The architecture of the language itself suggested that the mental category had not formed in the way it forms in almost every other documented human group. But the researchers had been in enough communities to know that the absence of a word does not necessarily mean the absence of an experience. Languages lose and gain vocabulary. Concepts get bundled into other concepts. The absence could have been linguistic without being psychological. So they watched, for months, they watched how the Chewong responded to uncertainty, to bad weather coming, to food shortages, to illness, to the deaths that happen in every community regardless of how it is organized. They watched how people talked about the future, whether they talked about the future at all, and in what register, with what emotional weight. What they observed was this. The Chewong engaged with threat when threat was present. They prepared for what could be prepared for. They responded to what arrived. And when the threat was not present, when there was nothing actionable, nothing immediate, nothing that could be addressed right now, they appeared genuinely and not as a performance to set it down. Not suppression, not denial, not the carefully maintained surface calm of a people who have learnt that expressing fear is dangerous. Actual release, the thing was not there, and so they were not carrying it. The researchers watched this and felt something they struggled to name in their field notes. Something between admiration and a deep unsettling recognition of everything their own minds never stopped doing. Here is what psychology knows about worry, really knows, not the self-help version, not the productivity framework version, the clinical, neurological, evolutionary version. Worry is not a flaw, it's a feature. It evolved as a cognitive tool for threat simulation, the ability to run mental rehearsals of things that have not happened yet, in order to prepare for them, to identify danger before it arrives, to solve problems in advance of encountering them. In the environment where human cognition developed, where threats were physical, immediate, and required rapid response, this was extraordinarily useful. The brain that could anticipate the predator, the drought, the rival group, was the brain that survived to pass its architecture forward. The problem is that the modern world presents the worry system with a category of threat it was never designed to process. Not physical threats, not immediate ones, abstract ones, future ones, threats that exist not in the environment, but in the mind's projection of what the environment might become. Financial collapse, social humiliation, the slow erosion of a career, the possibility of illness, the fear of being found inadequate by people whose opinion has somehow become load-bearing in the architecture of the self. These threats have no physical resolution. You cannot run from them. you cannot fight them. The worry system, which evolved to process fear into action, receives them and has nowhere to send the signal, so it circles. It returns to the same material again and again, generating the same activation without producing the resolution that activation was built to deliver. This is chronic anxiety, not a disorder in the pathological sense, a mismatch, a tool being used on a problem it was not shaped to solve. The Chewong lived inside threats that were immediate, physical, and resolvable by action. The forest was dangerous, weather was dangerous, illness was dangerous. These were threats the worry system was built for. Engage, resolve, release. What they did not have, what their way of life had never generated, was the particular category of abstract, unresolvable, future projected threats that the modern mind swims in constantly. They were not less intelligent, they were not less sensitive, they were not psychologically simpler. They were running the same hardware in a completely different environment, and the hardware in that environment was not producing the output that ours produces every day before we have even finished our first cup of coffee. Here is where the research stopped being straightforward. The researchers had gone in expecting one of two things. Either the Chewong would disprove the hypothesis, they would find worry under the surface, expressed differently, wearing different loads, or they would confirm it and the confirmation would be simple. A people without chronic anxiety. Prove that it is not universal. Conclusion, paper, return flight. Neither of those things happened cleanly because what the researchers found, the longer they stayed, was that the Chewong were not without suffering. They were without a specific kind of suffering, the anticipatory, recursive, self-generated kind. But they experienced grief deeply, loss fully. The death of a child did not pass through them like weather. It landed, it stayed. They mourned in ways that were completely recognizable as mourning. What they did not do was pre-mourn. They did not spend years dreading the losses before the losses happened. They did not lie awake generating mental simulations of future grief. They did not carry the weight of what might happen as though it had already happened. And researchers found themselves unable to determine with any certainty, with any methodology they trusted, whether this was psychological health or psychological difference. Whether it was something to understand as a better way of being in the world or simply a different way, whether the absence of anticipatory suffering represented a kind of freedom or a kind of limitation they were not equipped to see. One of the researchers wrote in her private notes, not in the published paper, that spending 4 months with the Chewong had made her realize that almost everything she had spent her career calling baseline human psychology was not baseline at all. It was the psychology of a specific kind of society, a specific set of conditions, a specific relationship between the self and time. She wrote, I came here to study them. I left wondering who had actually been studied. The findings from that expedition and the research that followed it fed into something much larger, a growing body of cross-cultural psychology that was asking the question the few had largely avoided for most of its history. How much of what we call human psychology is actually human? And how much of it is the psychology of a particular kind of civilization that we've mistaken for a universal condition? The answer, the more cultures the researchers examined, the more uncomfortable it became. Concepts that the Western psychology had treated as fundamental features of human mental life, chronic anxiety, social comparison, the relentless forward projection of the self into an imagined future, turned out to be far less universal than the textbooks had assumed. Present in many cultures, dominant in some, virtually absent in others. What varied was not the brain was the same. What varied was what the brain had been given to do, the problems it had been asked to solve, the social structures it was operating inside, the relationship with time that the culture had built around it. The Chewong had not evolved different minds, they had built a world that made different demands on the mind they had. And in doing so, without intending to, without theorizing about it, without writing a single paper on the subject, they had produced something that the most advanced psychological research in the world is still trying to manufacture artificially. A population of people for whom the present moment is not something to escape, but simply where they are. Without trying, without practice, without being told it was something they should want, it was just Tuesday. They were just here. The scientists came home. They came home to inboxes and mortgages and performance reviews and the particular texture of modern life that ooms with a frequency of low-grade threats that nobody can quite locate and nobody can quite switch off. They came home to a world that had not changed while they were gone and that felt, after 4 months inside a completely different relationship with time and threat and the future, slightly more strange than it felt before they left. Several of them changed research directions after that expedition. One left academia entirely, not in crisis, in clarity. She said later that watching people live without the weight she had always assumed was simply part of being a person had made her unwilling to spend the rest of her career studying the weight without questioning whether it was necessary. None of them came back with a solution. That is the honest thing to say. They cannot import a way of being. You cannot take the conditions that produced a particular relationship with time and graft them onto a society built on entirely different foundations. The Chewong's freedom from anticipatory suffering is not a technique. It is the byproduct of a whole world, a whole set of relationships between people and nature and time and the self that took generations to build and that exists nowhere else in quite that form. But they came back with a question that is harder to set down than any of the data. If chronic worry is not a universal feature of human psychology, if it is a product of conditions rather than a fixed property of the mind, then what does that say about how much of our suffering we have accepted as inevitable that isn't? What does it say about the weight we carry so constantly, so automatically, so completely without questioning whether it belongs to us, that we have stopped being able to imagine what it would feel like to set it down? The Chewong had no word for worry. We have built entire industries around managing it, and somewhere in the distance between those two sentences is something worth sitting with for longer than is comfortable.